Good afternoon, Professor Eng Seng Ho, Director of the Middle East Institute, Mr. J.Y. Pillay, Chairman of the Singapore Council of Presidential Advisors, Your Excellencies from the Diplomatic Corps, respected professors and researchers, honorable guests, ladies and gentlemen. It's my pleasure to welcome you to the Middle East Institute's Prominent Speaker Series featuring Professor Bernard Haykel. Professor Haykel's lecture today is entitled Transformation of Saudi Arabia. Can MBS's economic and religious reforms succeed? Without further ado, I am pleased to invite the Director of MEI, Professor Eng Seng Ho, to give his welcoming remarks. Professor Ho, if you will.
Thank you, Wayne. Dear honored guests, welcome to the Middle East Institute. I'm very happy today to have with us Professor Bernard Haykel from Princeton University. It's been very hard to get Bernard Haykel here to Singapore. I've been trying for a year and a half, 2 years. And even though we're old friends, he actually has quite a busy schedule. I was able to get him here because we were both invited to the World Peace Forum in Beijing this past weekend. So I took the chance to say, why don't you stop over in Singapore? So here we are with Professor Haykel in Singapore. We first knew each other when we worked in Yemen in the 1990s, before the Civil War and after. And we became good friends in Yemen. As you know, things are usually tough, and so we became good friends there, and we both went through our doctoral work together and through our academic careers. So we know each other quite well. But as I said, he's quite busy, so it's hard to get him here. Professor Haykel did his undergraduate degree in Georgetown University. So from there, he had a lot of experience in international politics. He then did a PhD in Islamic law and history at Oxford University on Yemen. And I should say that Professor Haykel's original core expertise is law and history. And through law and history, he came to understand the formation of the quite unique Zaydi state in Yemen under the Zaydi Imams, and its transformation into, you could say, a Zaydi-Sunni combination sort of state, which then became the basis for the modern Yemeni state. And so through his core expertise in law, Professor Haykel has been able to expand his expertise and his experience through various domains into politics, economics, oil and energy, and so on. So we have here quite an unusual scholar who is able to understand the many dimensions of law, economics, politics, culture, religion also, I would add. And I think for some place like the Middle East, you really need to be able to pull together all these different dimensions in order to understand the dynamics of the place. And we at MEI understand this. We have an organization which has 3 clusters: political economy, trans-systemic law, and Arabia-Asia relations. And normally each of these clusters organizes a talk around their cluster of, around their expertise. Seldom are we able to get a scholar who can pull all these different cluster interests together. And on top of that, Professor Haykel has been going to the region for a long time. He has a lot of practical experience. He has direct contact with the leadership of many of these countries. And so he is able to pull together the multiple dimensions, not just from a scholarly perspective, but also from the perspective of people who have responsibility running these countries and who face practical and ideological challenges in steering a middle path through this very troubled region. I will just add that Professor Haykel grew up in Lebanon in the 70s, where you had a long-running civil war. And I believe that growing up in this sort of civil war has given Professor Haykel a very grounded and clear-eyed understanding of what goes on in the Middle East. I remember before the American invasion of Iraq, he had warned that if you break Iraq, you will have the explosion of sectarian problems. And in a way, perhaps like Lebanon, many people did not believe it at that time, but it turns out to be quite prophetic. I won't take into his time, and I will just give you Professor Haykel, please.
Thank you. Thank you very much for that very generous and kind introduction. It's a real pleasure to be here. Actually, I wanted to come to Singapore. I wasn't that interested in Beijing. I had been there before, and it is my first time here, and it's a real pleasure. I feel completely at home. I'm not quite sure why, but I do feel at home here. And today I'm going to speak to you about Saudi Arabia. I'm going to speak to you about the Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman and his project. I promise you it will not be a very academic talk, but rather a very factual and fact-based analysis that will also try to offer some speculative ideas about the nature of, about the future prospects of this transformation. In my view, the most important and most significant change that is happening in the Middle East today is what is taking place in Saudi Arabia. All the traditional views of academics and people who watch the country about the nature of politics, about the nature of the state, the nature of state and society relations have been upended by the rise of the Crown Prince. And let me give you a sense of some of this wisdom before the rise of the Crown Prince. So for a very long time, the country, from at least 1953, at the time of the death of the founder, King Abdul Aziz, who was an absolute monarch in the true sense. All power was centered on him. But from his death until 1915, the country was run by a king who was the first among equals, but essentially in a consensual, in a system that was based on consensus amongst brothers who were roughly of the same age. King Abdulaziz had about 34 surviving sons, and not all of them were important. A handful were, and they each took over a different bit of the government and of the country. One was in charge of the Ministry of the Interior, another was in charge of the Governorate of Riyadh, for instance, another was in charge of Ministry of Defense. There were certain crown jewels in the country's bureaucracy that were never to be touched by royals, by princes. That was because they were really the engine that generated the revenue for the government and that managed this revenue. So the two principal institutions that were never controlled by princes, and this was kind of a rule, a golden rule inside the country, were Saudi Aramco, the oil company, which was fully nationalized by the late 1970s, early 1980s, and the other was the central bank of the country called SAMA, Saudi Arabian Monetary Agency. And it was always assumed that no prince would ever take over these institutions. And for a long time, because power was widely shared and diffused between these princes, decision-making was cumbersome, took a long time. Often, in fact, the country was saved by the nature of deliberation, in that decisions were not taken, and by which time some crisis which had to be decided on blew away. And because they hadn't decided on it, in fact, it saved the country from a potential disaster, because you don't always have to take a position on a given crisis. So it was a very unique system, quite opaque, and people assumed that this would continue into the future. But in 2015, January 2015, King Abdullah passed away and King Salman acceded to the throne. And King Salman is a very particular figure with a very strong personality, an extremely well-read individual, someone who follows the press, reads a lot of books, and has very strong views. And these strong views were present when he was still governor of Riyadh. And I first met him in 2005, 2006, and then I interviewed him again in 2007. And during that 2007 interview, it was very interesting to hear what the two principal axes that he felt the country needed to follow in order to survive. And it was very much set in terms of the survival of the dynasty and the survival of the country. The two axes were, one, the diversification, the economic diversification of the country. He was aware that the country produces between 200 and 230,000 students from its universities every year, and that jobs had to be found for these students. And that the government, which is the principal source of employment for the working population of the country, something like 70% of all working Saudis work for the government in the public sector, was unable to continue to keep producing jobs for these graduates. So that if you diversified the economy, if you generated a private sector that was quite dynamic, that generated jobs for these graduates, you were able to remove this burden from the government. And the government's principal source of revenue was oil. So it constantly made the country dependent on and linked to the vicissitudes of the international or the global oil market. If oil was up, government had a lot of money, it could throw it around. The oil price was down, it ran budgetary deficits, had to eat into its surpluses, into its savings, in order to keep this cradle to grave system of entitlements in play. This system that was instituted after the first oil shock of 1973 basically provided most Saudis with an incredible set of entitlements. Health care was free, education is free, most people were guaranteed jobs, people would be sent overseas on government scholarships. This is still ongoing in the kingdom. This is a country that really spends a tremendous amount on its population and does not tax. So you have to remember that there's absolutely no taxation in the kingdom. So it's a very particular setup, which was essentially unsustainable as far as then Prince Salman was concerned. The second axis that he focused on very clearly was the threat that Iran represented to the kingdom. This was an existential threat for him. And he said very clearly, look, you don't have to take my word for it. Just listen to what the Iranian leaders say in Persian. Not only do they call for death to America and death to Israel, but they also constantly, from the time of Imam Khomeini, vilify the Saudi royal family. They use very kind of abusive terms when they refer to the people of Saudi Arabia, the camel grazers of Najd, for instance. I mean, they're really racist terms that are used when referring to the Saudis. And this is something that, King Salman felt deeply. But to understand the threat of Iran, you have to go back to the relationship that binds Saudi Arabia to the United States. As I see it, the Saudis felt that the strategic alliance that they had with the United States had really started to unravel after the Cold War, and that an alternative had to be found, not to completely decouple the relationship. In fact, Saudi Arabia is very keen on maintaining a very strong and friendly relationship with the United States. And you can see this with the Crown Prince. His lawyers, his investors, many of his principal advisors are American. But something did happen after the Cold War. And I want to briefly outline a sequence of events that I think explain why King Salman feels the Iranian threat quite keenly, and what he thinks the remedies to that threat are. So, backing up a bit, in 1945, when the President of the United States, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, met with King Abdul Aziz, a deal was struck. This is very well known. The deal was essentially one where Saudi Arabia would remain not just a loyal ally to the United States, but would become, in effect, the central bank of oil in the world. It would consistently and reliably provide oil to international oil markets without using oil as a weapon, which was only used by the Saudis once in 1973 and never again. They would provide oil. That oil was extremely necessary after World War II because it was what allowed for the rebuilding of Europe, of Western Europe, the rebuilding of Japan, and that the Saudis would constantly keep that market lubricated and not use it as a weapon. Unlike many other post-colonial states who saw oil very much as a weapon and wanted to use it against the West. The second part of the deal was that the United States would provide Saudi Arabia with military protection against external aggression. Right? Now, once the Cold War ended, the nature of America's alliances with other countries in the world were put into question by Americans. And it stopped being clear where the Saudis fit into the American system of alliances. The Saudis had been extremely helpful to the Americans in the Cold War and the fight against communism and against socialists and pan-Arab movements, but a questioning began. Then that questioning increased in the United States with the events of 9/11. You must remember that 15 of the 19 hijackers were Saudis, and that many people in America felt that given that Osama bin Laden was a Saudi citizen, that Saudi Arabia was in fact not necessarily an ally, but perhaps even an enemy. I mean, in the crude analysis of popular American thinking, there was considerable animus generated by 9/11 against Saudi Arabia. That relationship, though, because of 9/11, was initially dealt with quite smoothly because President Bush was in charge, and the Bush family had a very close and intimate relationship with the Saudi royal family, and that was managed. But it created turbulence in the relationship. The turbulence increased in 2003 with the Iraqi war. The Saudi leadership was very much against the American invasion of Iraq. They felt very strongly and rightly that if America invaded Iraq, the majority population of Iraq, the Shiites, would end up getting power. And that amongst the Shiites, those who were in closest alliance with Iran and who were clients of Iran and who were the best organized and the most violent of the Shiites would end up taking over the politics of Iraq. And in effect, the Americans would sooner or later have to leave, and Iraq would be handed over on a silver platter to the Iranians. Those are the exact words, in fact, of the late Foreign Minister of Saudi Arabia, Prince Saud al-Faisal. The Americans nonetheless went ahead and invaded Iraq, and exactly what the Saudis predicted happened. The Saudis, being allies of the United States, provided logistical support to the Americans. They were allowed to use bases in Saudi Arabia, and the invasion took place. So again, more turbulence in the relationship. Turbulence increased further with the arrival of President Obama to power. President Obama arrived in 2008. He did three things that were extremely damaging to the relationship. The first thing he did was to talk about a pivot to the East, a pivot to this region of the world, which was interpreted in the Middle East and in Saudi Arabia as basically an abandonment of the Middle East. That America was tired of the Middle East because of the repeated wars that it had engaged in, wanted to move east and emphasize the Middle East much less. The second thing Obama did was to abandon President Mubarak during the Arab Spring events of late 2009, early 2010. In Egypt, Mubarak had been a long-standing ally of the United States, and Obama was willing to basically pressurize him into leaving office. I can tell you the details about this if you want in the Q&A. And to support the Muslim Brotherhood, who would be elected in Egypt. And Obama was seen as very much in favor of the Muslim Brotherhood, and the Muslim Brotherhood, you must remember, is a major menace to the Saudi regime because they claim to rule on the basis of Islam. They have an alternative ideology to that of the Saudis, and the Saudis don't feel comfortable with them, to say the least. So he's favoring the Muslim Brotherhood, Obama that is, was problematic. The third thing that Obama did, and this was the final nail in the coffin, was to begin to cozy up with Iran, to talk about Iran as a great civilization, to tell the Saudis that they had to learn to share the region with the Iranians, which basically meant that the Iranians had a legitimate sphere of influence inside the Arab world, and that the Saudis had to accept this. So the Saudis did not like President Obama, and I think the feeling was very, very much mutual. So those events made the Saudis realize that, we can no longer rely on the United States as an ultimate backstop for our survival and our protection. We need to build up our own resources. And what that means, in effect, is to build up your military and political capacities. You have to build up your military, you have to build up your political abilities to be able to become a regional power that can stand up to challenges, especially the one represented by Iran. And Iran, as you know, as many of you may know, uses non-state actors, projects influence through Shiite Arabs, whether in Lebanon or in Iraq or in Syria or in Bahrain, and now since 2009 in Yemen through the Houthis. So when King Salman arrived in 2015, he felt that he had been handed he had been dealt a very poor hand. He delegated power to the crown prince. Initially, MBS was not the first crown prince. There was a first crown prince that King Salman, when he acceded, was Prince Mukrin. He was, as it were, dismissed. Another crown prince, Mohammed bin Naif, was appointed as crown prince. He was the minister of the interior. And then finally, Mohammed bin Naif was dismissed by the king, and MBS, the son of the king, was appointed crown prince. And he is the one who has been given basically de facto control and rule over the country, very much with the king in the background backing him. And there's absolutely no daylight between the king and between the crown prince Mohammed bin Salman. Otherwise, other people would have taken advantage. People within the family, people who are antagonistic to MBS, would have tried to take advantage of that daylight. So, but it does not exist. So MBS was in effect put into power and to carry out King Salman's vision. And that vision really consists of these two poles: building up your military and political capacities and diversifying your economy. And the feeling that the country had been dealt a poor hand and had to improve it. So now turning to MBS, he has a very particular view of what is necessary. The view is a fairly radical one if you see it from sort of a traditional Saudi perspective. The first element of the view is that the country has to be socially transformed. You have to engage in social reforms that basically turn the dial down on religion. That the turn that the country made in 1979 to dial up religion when it was confronting the Iranian Revolution, which was also a religious revolution, that dial had to be turned way down, and you had to socially transform the country in ways that would give women greater rights. As you all know, women now can drive in Saudi Arabia. The religious police that used to harass people in the streets has been tamed and basically brought back into their, the equivalent of barracks. They can no longer harass people. Music and concerts can be brought in. Cinemas and movie theaters are being brought in. Saudis no longer need to look to Bahrain or to Dubai or to Geneva or to Paris or to London for entertainment. They should stay at home and spend their money at home. So a kind of a social revolution of sorts is necessary. And that is something that he is very much engaged in. In order to do that, though, he has had to tame the religious establishment. And you have to remember that Saudi Arabia, 22 million or so native Saudis, another 9 or 10 million guest workers. Of the 22 million, there are very conservative elements in that society. I mean, conservative to the point of being reactionaries. They don't want to see some of these changes happen, especially those who are either look to the religious establishment for guidance, or who look to the religious leaders who are not part of the religious establishment, but who are kind of religious entrepreneurs in society, and who use religion in order to control and mobilize people in terms of religious rhetoric, often against the regime. So MBS has pushed this agenda, and he has had to tame the religious establishment. The official religious establishment was told in no uncertain terms that these changes are happening, and if they don't like it, they can basically lump it. I mean, they have to accept. The non-religious, the religious folk who are not part of the official religious establishment, who are not civil servants, if they criticize, they've been put in prison. Or before being put in prison, they were warned. So this is a system that deals with people very intimately, There are personal connections directly to the royal court, and people were told that these things are happening, and if you push, you're going to be punished. And a number of them were put in prison. A number of them were also accused of having been on the payroll of Qatar, which is very much a state that promotes the Muslim Brotherhood and its ideology for purposes of its own that I can get into in the Q&A. So the religious establishment has had to be dealt with, and they are still there. There's still these reactionary elements in society, and anytime he makes a move, he has to keep that group in mind, very much in mind, because they represent a real social base in the society and a potential threat to his rule. The other reforms that he has engaged in are economic reforms, and here the efficacy and the efficiency of those reforms has been mixed. It's much more difficult, actually, to engage in economic reforms than to deal with some of the social reforms. Some of the social reforms involve opening up movie theaters, allowing women to drive. Those are things you can see instant sort of results from. Economic reforms are more complicated in the sense that you need to create jobs in the private sector. You need to incentivize the private sector to create these jobs. You need to be able to tell people they can no longer get jobs in the public sector. You need to create a regulatory environment for foreign direct investment. So, difficult. It's more difficult, especially in a society where the culture has been not to seek private sector work. Most people in Saudi Arabia want a job in government. It's better paid than in the private sector. So that requires a cultural change, and that's a much more difficult process to engage in. So that is something that is ongoing. Whether it will succeed is, I think very much in question. Lots of people feel, if you talk to ordinary Saudis, they say, he has this vision called the Vision 2030. If he only succeeds 20% of the goals that he has set for himself, that would be great. That would be already enough for us. He doesn't have to succeed 100%. So the vision is very much an aspirational vision. I think that there will be failures and there will be successes. The problem with the economic transformation vision is that he has made all kinds of promises and aspirational promises to the population that have raised expectations. So let me talk about the population here for a second. 70% of the Saudi public is under the age of 30. So most of the people are quite young. And they see MBS as someone who is sort of like a knight in shining armor, someone who will completely transform the country. They can see some of the changes already happening. And they have placed tremendous hopes on his ability to effect change. And often the change that is involved will entail tremendous pain, serious pain, because people will have to take jobs that are not very well paying. They would have to work very hard, all the kinds of things that are involved in a major transformation of the country. And I think the management of the expectations of the young who favor him, if you look at the data on how liked he is, how much people approve of him, it's in the 90s. So it's vast majorities of the young love him. I think he has to manage those expectations, because if he ends up not delivering on some of these promises, he could definitely get into serious trouble with potential mobilization of people in the streets, making demands for better employment, better opportunities, and so on. And the Islamists and the reactionaries are always there, waiting in the wings to be able to take and channel and frame and provide a context for these expectations that are not fulfilled. So that is a constant challenge for him. Now, turning away from the economics to the politics, there is no vision, as far as I can see, or idea of reform politically in MBS's agenda. He has concentrated and consolidated power in a way that is reminiscent of the first king's rule. When the first king ruled, he was an absolute monarch, and I think the vision is to kind of move away from the consensus politics of that intermediate period between 1953 and 2015 towards something where you have a monarch who is an absolute monarch in every sense of the word. And the argument is that you need that kind of setup in order to push through the reforms that are necessary. And if those reforms are not pushed through, the country is headed towards disaster. It will end up going over a cliff because it's budgetarily unsustainable, and in terms of military and political power, undefendable, because the military is not powerful enough to defend the country. So you need to have this kind of absolute monarch who controls all the coercive and financial military capabilities of the state. So you have a very powerful state now under the control of one man. And that's the argument that he makes. And his vision is very much an authoritarian vision. In terms of how he's trying to project power, you have probably heard and know that he is engaged in 3 or 4 major policy initiatives. The first was right upon arriving to the king's arrival to power, which is the war in Yemen, the involvement in the war in Yemen. And the Saudis, along with the UAE, their allies, and the UAE, have moved into militarily into Yemen. The Saudis principally using their air force with some special forces. The UAE mobilized much more intensely on the ground with special forces to support Yemeni factions that are fighting a group called the Houthis, who are Zaidi Shiites, who have become very close allies of the Iranians and who are receiving financial, material, and ideological support from Iran and some of its proxies, principally Hezbollah in Lebanon. In September 2014, the Houthis, a group that has its own history in Yemen, that had fought a series of wars from 2005 to 2010 against the central government in Yemen, ended up taking over the capital Sana'a in September. And when they did that, it looked very clear to the Saudis, at least, that Yemen could now be controlled and dominated by the Houthis in the same way that Lebanon is controlled and dominated by Hezbollah. And that through the Houthis, the Saudis could build up a militia and also a force that would have rockets and missiles aimed at Saudi Arabia's cities, not just the southern cities, but also Riyadh. And as you probably have heard, there are a series of ballistic missiles that the Houthis have shot at Riyadh, 2 of which blew up when I was there myself and I heard them. And for the Saudis, this is unacceptable. That situation where the Iranians could produce a proxy force in Yemen that could threaten them militarily is unacceptable. The Saudis view Yemen the way, for instance, the United States views Mexico. And if the Russians were trying to move in a militia into Mexico, the United States would quickly move to stop that from happening. It's a similar situation in Yemen. The problem, though, in Yemen, at least as far as the media and the coverage of the country, is that you have tremendous suffering in the country. It's a major humanitarian disaster. That humanitarian disaster precedes the Saudi involvement, the Saudi UAE involvement in the country. It has probably been made worse by the Saudi UAE involvement, but it precedes it. This is a country that has been mismanaged for decades, running out of water, major demographic explosion, lots of tensions between different Yemeni factions. There was already a civil war in Yemen before the Saudis got involved. Not a very messy situation, and not one to which there are clear solutions or silver bullet solutions. The Saudis, though, are very intent on stopping Iran from building this force in Yemen, and I see them as not stopping the war until such time as they can be guaranteed that the Iranians will never have a foothold in that country. So it is what it is as a situation. The other is the situation with Qatar, a state of the GCC. Very difficult for outsiders to fully comprehend why there is this tension with Qatar. From the Saudi perspective, the Qataris basically, there's a long history of tensions between the two countries, but essentially, the Qatar, when MBS and King Salman arrived in power in January of 2015, they saw a situation where the Qataris, and this is what they say, where the Qataris basically were not only funding Saudi dissidents all over the world, but they had a number of Saudis in the military and the government and so on the payroll. They had taken over the social media space of the Saudi of Saudi Arabia. So in other words, they had advanced technologies with bots and all kinds of ability to manipulate and maneuver the conversation on social media in whatever direction they wanted. The Qataris also were playing footsie with the Houthis, had funded the Houthis. More recently, if you've seen the coverage in the New York Times and the BBC, the Qataris had given money to a number of Shiite militias to release members of the royal family from who had been captured in Iraq. So Qatar basically was behaving in a way that was menacing and threatening Saudi Arabia's national security interests. And there were a series of agreements between Saudi Arabia and Qatar and the other GCC countries to try to convince Qatar to desist, to stop doing this. And the Qataris seem not to have stopped. So a boycott was declared. An alliance with the UAE, Bahrain, and Egypt was formed to boycott Qatar. And that situation, just like the one in Yemen, as far as I can tell, is not going to end anytime soon. It will be an ongoing situation, again, until such time as Qatar stops. From the Saudi perspective, you see, Qatar is to Saudi Arabia what Monaco is to France. All right, so you have to also think in terms of scale. Saudi Arabia is a very big country compared to all the other GCC countries, and it will not tolerate a country on its border doing the kinds of things that I just told you the Qataris were doing, based on what the Saudis have said that they were doing, and I have no real reason to doubt that these things were happening. So that's the second thing. On Syria, the Saudis seem to have withdrawn from involvement in that war. They still, of course, provide moral and material support to to Syrian refugees and to the situation of the people who are suffering under the Assad regime. But they see that the situation there has gotten very complicated with the arrival of the Russians, and they think that the Americans and the Israelis are probably better suited at dealing with the Iranian presence and threat in Syria, as well as the Turks in the north, than they are. They've tried to concentrate more closely on the most immediate and most strategic threats to the kingdom, namely the one emanating from Yemen and the one from Qatar. The building up the military, though, is being done through the war in Yemen. You can see that the Saudi military has gotten much better as a result of the war in Yemen. Their air force has gotten better, their training has gotten better, and so there is a fringe benefit or a silver lining to that war from the perspective of wanting to build up your own military capabilities. But what we see with MBS is this attempt to turn Saudi Arabia from a country that had basically been very much a client state of the United States into one in which it becomes a fully fledged, powerful actor in the region. The prospects of that transformation succeeding are difficult to assess. My view is that the kingdom has the capabilities, has the capacities, although there will be a lot of pain involved in this transformation. Thank you very much.